Hello and welcome to our 7-8 minutes of weekly Torah talk. We have another Australian edition. Our guest today is Rabbi Jeffrey B. Kamins of Emmanuel Synagogue, Sydney, Australia. Hello, Rabbi. Thank you for being with us.
Absolute pleasure.
Our parsha is Shoftim, and in Shoftim, Moshe instructs the people of Israel to appoint judges and law officers in every city. Crimes must be investigated and evidence examined. 2 credible witnesses are required for conviction. Shoftim also includes the prohibitions against idolatry and sorcery, laws governing the appointment of a king, and guidelines for the creation of cities of refuge for the inadvertent murderer. In this parsha there are many rules of war, the exemption from battle for one who has just built a home, planted a vineyard, married, or are afraid and soft-hearted. The requirement to offer terms of peace before attacking a city, and more such rules of war. The parsha concludes with the law of the Eglah Arufa, a procedure followed when a person is killed by an unknown murderer. The first pasuk of the parsha says, שופטים ושוטרים תיתן לך בכל שעריך אשר אדוני אלוהיך נותן לך לשבטיך ושפטו את העם משפט צדק. You shall set up judges and law enforcement officials for yourself in all your cities that the Lord your God is giving you for your tribes, and they shall judge the people with righteous judgment. So, Rabbi, in one of the most difficult instructions to follow in this parsha, these are especially difficult for a Jew, and maybe even more so for a modern Jew. The parsha says, "Lo tasur min hadavar asher yagidu lecha yamin u'smol," and you shall come. I'm reading it in English, the 2 psukim, and you shall come to the Leviti Kohanim and to the judge who will be in those days, and you shall inquire, and they will tell you the words of judgment. According to the law they instruct you, and according to the judgment they say to you, you shall do. You shall not divert from the word they tell you, either right or left. So that's it. We have to do what we are told to do by our judges or priests in every generation.
This seems to be the general interpretive tradition, although there are exceptions. And one of the reasons that I also find this passage both troublesome and intriguing is that it raises the question that it is especially one for us moderns, which is the question of authority versus autonomy. Now, in the days of the Torah, of course, we were a landed community. And if we think of ourselves as landed communities in the citizens of which were states, whether it be here in Australia, or I was born in the United States, or in our land of Israel, if you don't have a court system that has authority, then one has great difficulty in having any kind of consonance of behavior and communal cooperation, let's say. So how is that going to work? But on the other hand, what we're used to now in our times is that which we call democracy. So constitutions can sometimes be modified if one's country even has a constitution, which of course at this point Israel doesn't, for example. And furthermore, there tends to be a separation of legislative and judicial powers, which again isn't exhibited in the Torah tradition. So what happens is that if one is to take this passage as has been generally interpreted, one sees the autonomy of the individual being subservient to the authority both of the judges and the community. Now, it's interesting, it isn't necessarily read that way. So in the Sifri, it actually says the person, it appears to him that the right is right and the left, and so the notion is, and the Talmud Yerushalmi also kind of follows on that. Only when they tell you what is right and what is left, but if they, and so they're reading it in a slightly different way, as opposed to Rashi, who says, when right is left and left is right, then you have to follow them. So there is that tension in the tradition.
So basically, they give the court the power to interpret the law of the Torah, and the person the right to interpret the decision of the court.
So there is that little bit of opening in the tradition, but I would have to acknowledge that while there is that opening in the more ancient tradition, and of course we know that the Yerushalmi isn't as authoritative as the Bavli, once one goes down through the Rishonim and the Achronim, one sees a general coalescing that even when they tell you right is left and left is right, you must follow the ruling, not just of the Sanhedrin as it was in old times, but even the decisions of the sages. Now, I have actual sympathy toward that position in a certain sense, that, as I said, in any society, one needs to have authority in a judicial system. If the judicial system doesn't have authority, then there's anarchy. And okay, so the court ruled, this is the ruling. I don't like the court's ruling. It doesn't feel right to me. My issue is that it's not when it feels right, it's when it actually isn't right. What does one do when a court's ruling is actually unjust, is actually a miscarriage of justice? Now again, throughout the tradition, one sees, and I think it's ironic, as the power of the Beit Din has eroded, there has been a tendency of more commentators to assert the power of the Beit Din through no matter what. If they say right is left, left is right, you got to follow it. The individual is subservient to the decisions of the Beit Din.
Right, it's not just the power of the Beit Din that was eroded, it's also the power of the actual law. Surely today not all Jews agree on the interpretation of the law of the Torah as once was the case for at least most of the Jewish people.
It's the hugest problem we face as a people in the 21st century, and that's why this text is so poignant, because yes, it's not only authority and autonomy, but as you say, what is the issue of the authority of the Torah? And one of the fascinating verses that is used by Rashi and Ramban and other, well, Ramban in particular, but referring back and explicating Rashi and others, is this little verse from the Tehillim, where in Psalm 119, verse 127, it says, and in verse 126, it says, Et lasot l'Adonai eferu toratecha. Now, that's generally translated as, it's the time to do the will of God, even when they have made void your Torah.
Right.
And then, but the question is,
sometimes
it
means that sometimes we need to break the rules in order to maintain the general idea of the rule, or to maintain the power of the law.
So, or is it's time to do the will of God for they have made void your Torah, and who's the they that's being referred to? That's what, so it takes into question, you have God, you have the Torah, and who are the they that are uprooting the Torah? To me, this is one of the fascinating questions of the 21st century, and to me the question is not only of God's authority and authorship behind Torah, but the other way around as well. How is Torah meant to be there as the guide for our people in service of God? And one of the things that I like to see is that when we actually look at the multitude of textual tradition and see the context in it, we recognize that there is not a monolithic voice there. And I actually don't think there's really ever been a monolithic voice. And for a lot of time, there was a self-awareness and self-consciousness of the playfulness of Torah and making Torah malleable and being able to be expandable or contractable to suit the needs of the contemporary community of the rabbis of the period of time. And so I would, in that sense, say that to me there's a danger that people have made void God's Torah through an overemphasis on taking their authority as read, full stop. And actually, God's Torah is better served, and it is time to do the will of God by actually questioning rabbinic authority and showing the expanse of the tradition and the dialectic and the discussion that is right through the tradition.
Rabbi, thank you so much, and Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.